Introduction. This YouTube contains 20 out of the 50 questions that are older and less frequently asked and answered. This highlighted excerpt completes the Advaita is Vedanta YouTube part of the trilogy. The YouTube and book trilogy began with Part 1, Advaita is Vedanta, Experiences, States, Stations, and Samskaras. Then came Part 2, the YouTube, Excerpts from Nothing Comes from Nothing, 20 of the original 100 most frequently asked questions. And then the book, Nothing Comes from Nothing, the complete 100 most frequently asked questions. Finally, Part 3, 20 of the 50 older and less frequently asked questions. This YouTube begins in the early 1980s with an overview of the roots of quantum psychology. The story first appears in 1979 when Nisargadattovi Maharāj tells an Indian gentleman that his spiritual practice is to study quantum physics. This interaction was not translated to me at the time, and so I did not know what had been spoken by Maharaj. Years later, when I heard what Maharaj had said, it literally blew my mind. Why? Because I had thought that updating the ancient metaphors and using 20th century science in order to develop quantum psychology was my idea. I obviously did not realize, but somehow Maharaj's words and vibrations, even though they were not translated, had entered me like a virus. Although what Maharaj had spoken was completely unknown to me in 1979, I found myself upon my return from India in 1982 becoming totally absorbed in the study of quantum physics and neuroscience. Advaita is Vedanta Part 3 begins upon returning from India in 1982 and teaching Kashmir Shaivism and self-inquiry, and goes on to conclude with the absolute prior to consciousness, the absolute prior to awareness, and the absolute prior to the absolute nothingness. Part 3 of Advaita is Vedanta represents a trajectory and takes us full circle by highlighting 20 of the 50 older, less frequently asked questions. Once again, as you watch this YouTube or read the book, please keep tucked away somewhere all that is heard or that is about to be read, seen, or heard is non-existent. Shankara. Much love, your Mirage brother, Stephen Narayan. Self-inquiry. Question. In the early 1980s and in your books, Hearts on Fire and Quantum Consciousness, you talk about Ramana Maharshi's self-inquiry and about Kashmir Shaivism and the Vijnana Bhairav. Can you say something about how they all integrate into self-inquiry? Ramana Maharshi's approach was to trace the I thought to its origins. So a thought arises and subsides, and there's a space. And a thought arises and subsides, and there's a space. So the two basic ways is to where does that thought subside? To where does that thought subside? To where does that thought subside? So a thought arises, it subsides, space. Arises, subsides, space. Another way to trace the I thought is from where does the I arise? So it's space, thought, space, thought, space, thought. So from where does it arise and to where it subsides to is the same space. It arises, subsides, space. Arises, subsides, space. So Ramana Maharshi would talk about trace the I thought. The second approach that Maharshi had was simply, who is this I? Or to whom does this thought arise? It arises to me. Who is this I? So if a thought goes by called I love myself, or a thought goes by called I hate myself, normally, which is the first question I asked Maharaj when I met him, I grab onto it and say, that's me. So if you say a thought goes by called I love myself or hate myself, to whom does this thought arise? It arises to me. Who is this I? What happens is you move from the thought and feeling state called I hate myself to whom does this thought arise? Arises to me. Who is this I? All of a sudden, I'm the observer where I can witness that thought and it disappears. So to whom does this thought arise? It arises to me. Who is this I? So even as you're listening to this, you can notice a thought and you can notice to where does that thought subside? 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 In the Vijnana Bhairav, there's one exercise, or one dharana it's called, where you listen to the sound of the plucking of a stringed instrument. But if you pay attention slowly, you'll follow the stringed instrument, and there'll be a space. So you notice the space at the end of the sound of my voice. Most people will focus their attention on the words and what's being said and lose the space or the background from which the words and everything arises and subsides back into. So even as you're sitting here, you can notice the space at the end of each sound in my voice. The beauty of the Vijnana Bhairav, and where it overlaps, is you're always using everything in your life to bring you back to the space between two thoughts by either noticing the space or to where does that thought subside or from where does that thought arise from, all the same space. Maharaj had a different twist on it. So the illusion is that there's one solid observer, and a thought goes by, I love myself, I hate myself, I've heard this all before, I'm glad I'm listening to this, I want to turn it off. All of that stuff goes on. But actually there is not a separate observer or one observer. With each thought that arises and subsides, there is a different observer and observed. With every thought that arises and subsides, there's a different knower and known that arises and subsides. It comes as a dyad. So rather than to where does that thought subside, it would be what observer is observing that? So again, as you're listening to this and you notice any thought that comes by, you can notice that you're the observer of the thought. And then notice what occurs when I say, what observer is observing that? Notice another thought. Be the knower of the thought. What knower is knowing that? Notice another thought. Be the awarer of that thought. Notice what occurs when I say, what awarer is awaring that? What happens is you go blank, because what Maharaj said was that the experiencer is contained within the experience. Breaking that down into pieces, there is a different experiencer that experiences every experiences. It's very subtle. So what knower is knowing that brings you prior to the knower-known dyad. What observer is observing that brings you prior to the observer and the observed. What awarer is awaring that brings you prior to the awarer and what it's aware of. Another way to view that is, what thinker is thinking that? So I have a thought called, I hate this. You notice the thought. What thinker is thinking that? Notice another thought. What thinker is thinking that? Notice a feeling state. What feeler is feeling that? Notice another thought or feeling. What observer is observing that? So Maharaj had two ways, at least with me personally, that he did that, which was what knower is knowing that, which moved me prior to the knower known. And he'd say to me, who is the knower? What knower is knowing that prior to the knower known? Who is the knower? Who is the knower moves me prior to or without the knower known dyad into not knowing. When Bodhidharma went to China and brought what eventually would become Zen Buddhism to Japan, the empress said to him, who are you? And he said, not knowing. In other words, what knower is knowing that? What observer is observing that? There's just blank not knowing, or no knowingness. That blank knowingness is what Maharaj called the nonverbal I am. Now, the last part of the question is Kashmir Shaivism and the Vijnana Bhairav. The most important of the dharnas, or techniques, in tantric yoga, particularly dealing with emotional states, is there's a feeling that you experience, and then the mind makes up a story as to why. Now, how I got this was I was living in India, and I started doing the Vijnana Bhairav in the early 1970s with a fabulous book, classic, called Zen Flesh, Zen Bones by Paul Reps. And if you go to the very back, the Vijnana Bhairav is just kind of listed as 112 statements. But when I got clearer about this over time, I was sitting in my room, and I was in my 20s, and I started having sexual fantasies. Who wouldn't? And all of a sudden, I was remembering the Vijnana Bhairav, which is from the mere remembrance of touching, pressing, kissing, pleasant sensations arise. But those pleasant sensations are arising within you. Now that seems very, very obvious, but what would happen is, and this is the key to tantric yoga, is that I would have these pleasant sensations, and almost instantaneously the mind would make up a sexual fantasy. Or I was having anger or sadness or fear, and the mind would make up a story as to why I felt it. Now, what's important is that the mind, you immediately start chasing these sexual fantasies or these desires, sensations, and all of a sudden the mind gives you a desire. I want a new car, a new relationship, or whatever it is. There's a focus of attention on the story: car, new relationship, sexual fantasies, anger, why I'm angry, and so on. And so what happens is you focus on that. In the purest form of tantric yoga, which I think Kashmir Shaivism is, you take all your attention off of the story as to why you're feeling what you're feeling, and you turn it around, and you put that your attention on the feelings themselves as energy or consciousness. So I feel angry. Rather than me getting angry at that fantasy story, I take my attention off. I notice where in my body I feel these feelings. I focus my entire attention on the anger itself, or the sexual fantasy itself, or the desire itself, the feeling. And then you remove the label and you have it as energy or consciousness. The most important takeaway from it, though, is you have to be able to do this, take the attention off, put it on the feeling state itself, without the intention of getting rid of it. If I have a thing like, I'm afraid, and there's a story as to why I'm afraid, and I go, oh, I don't want fear, and I take my attention off with the intention of getting rid of the fear, then I am resisting the fear. So I have a judgment, evaluation, or significance placed on that. So without getting too complex, take the attention off of the story as to why you're feeling what you're feeling, turn it around on the feelings themselves without the intention of getting rid of it, then take the label off and have it as energy or consciousness. So all three of these, Ramana Maharshi, Nisargadatta, the Vijnana Vairava, and Kashmir Shaivism, all of them work together. Ramana has a tendency to be a little more with thoughts, and the tantric approach has more of a focus of attention on sensations or feeling states. So as a final exercise, notice a story that you have about anger, sadness, fear, or a sexual fantasy. Notice where in your body you feel those sensations and allow them to build, and focus your attention on the story as to why you feel anger or fear, or if it's sexual fantasy, it'll be the person. Very gently, take your attention off of the story as to why you feel what you feel and turn it around and focus your attention on the feelings themselves. Allow them to do whatever they do as you take the label off and just have that as energy or consciousness, allowing it to do whatever it is it does. And again, this is where all three of these, not really systems, this is where all three of these mesh or come together. Maharshi's self-inquiry, Maharaja's approach, and also, of course, the Kashmir Shaivism, Vijnana Vairava tantric approach. Question: why, after meditation, do thoughts and feelings and perceptions, etc., keep coming back? Thoughts, feelings, emotions, associations, perceptions keep coming back because the consciousness and the space are holographic. That means the space and the consciousness carry with them everything holographically. So your anger, your sadness, your love, your hate, your entire thing is one holographic package. Now, even if you go into the big emptiness, the Buddhists actually, in the 6 yogas of Naropa, break down the emptiness into 2 emptinesses, so to speak. One, they call the manifesting void. In other words, a manifesting kind of void, which manifests in this holographic and contains all thoughts, memories, emotions, associations, perceptions, etc., in a collective way. And then there's the unmanifesting void. So when you drop into the space, not only do you have your, in quotes, personal thoughts, memories, emotions, associations, perceptions, but also there's, if you go even deeper into the big emptiness, it contains a manifesting void and an unmanifesting void. Now, the second reason things come back is vibrationally, I am in normal consciousness, in quotes. All of a sudden, I sit in meditation, and my vibration, if you will, slows down or changes or shifts. Those thoughts, energies, emotions, associations can only exist at a certain vibrational level. When I go into, in quotes, meditation, those thoughts and memories and all these things can't exist there. So therefore, they don't. But when I, in quotes, come back to normal consciousness and the phone rings and I have my relationship and all these things, everything comes back because it only exists at a certain vibratory level or at a certain vibratory rate. Question. You mentioned the spiritual heart. Can you say something a little bit more about the spiritual heart? As I mentioned in the first YouTube, the spiritual heart, also called the high heart, is called Hridaya. Now, Ramana Maharshi said to trace the I thought back to where it arose from. Whenever they asked Ramana Maharshi, where is this space? Maharshi would always go, point here. And so there is a high heart, which is a spiritual heart, which is the absolute nothingness from where everything arises and subsides back into. So as a practice right now, to go back into the absolute nothingness of the spiritual heart, what I'd like you to do is to just notice any particular feeling that you're having in your body. And then just peel back the feeling. Let's say it's anger or sadness or fear. Peel the feeling back and notice what's underneath it. Peel the next one back. Notice what's underneath it. Peel the next one back and notice what's underneath it. And keep peeling back the layers until you get to the nothing, and just go into the big nothingness. So as you keep peeling the layers back and you can start with your body. As you start peeling the layers back, you go back the way you came, and there's just this vast emptiness. Now, another add-on to this would be from the 6 yogas of Naropa, which basically is, with your eyes closed, as you go back into the absolute nothingness, you expand and allow everything in the universe to be the emptiness. Then you can contract that emptiness all the way back into your heart. So it's just an emptiness in your heart. And you can practice expanding so that everything is emptiness. Then contracting the emptiness back to the space within the heart. Emptiness, back into the space in the heart. Back in the early 80s, the very, very first meditation we taught in quantum psychology was so simple. It was, without depending upon thoughts, memories, emotions, associations, perceptions, etc. Are you a man, a woman, or neither? So with your eyes closed, even now, without depending upon thoughts, memories, emotions, associations, perceptions, are you defined, undefined, or neither? Now, as you continue that, you'll notice there's just without depending upon any of those things, almost like an emptiness moves from background to foreground. That is the spiritual heart. In Buddhism, particularly again in the 6 yogas of Naropa, they might call it the Bodhi heart. So in Hinduism or in Yoga land, it might be called Hridaya, or the spiritual heart. In Buddhism, they might call it the Bodhi heart. But basically, it is the nothingness or the absolute nothingness. And that's why Nisargadatta Maharaj said, quote, "You will get maturity quickly if you stay in your nothingness." Spanda and Kashmir Shaivism. Question: can you say something more about the Spanda and how it specifically relates to spiritual practice? Spanda means the pulsation. Spanda is the movement. Nisargadatta Maharaj called karma movement. It's the actual movement. So things appear, something, nothing, something, nothing. Now, what's fascinating is that in spiritual practice, you have something, nothing. The you call yourself appears, and then it disappears. It appears and disappears. Awareness and consciousness appear, and awareness and consciousness disappear. You don't notice it because there's no vehicle to know or know about it. You can't have consciousness or know about consciousness if there's no consciousness there. There's no I there as the appearance, disappearance. It appears, it disappears, as awareness and consciousness does. Now, let's say, for example, you're doing neti neti or neti neti, Gyan Yoga, and you have the appearance of you who appears, gives the illusion of deconstructing neti neti or neti neti, not this, not this, not this, not this, or to where does that thought subside, or from where does that thought arise from, or it's all energy or consciousness. All of those processes, all of a sudden you go into a blank, no state. So you assume that I am doing a practice, and through the neti neti or neti neti, that space is found and there's a no state or a stateless state. But actually, you are not the doer. Why? Because the spanda is prior to it. So the I appears, the I disappears. Awareness appears, awareness disappears. Consciousness appears, consciousness disappears. When the I appears, it imagines it is doing or dreams that it's doing a spiritual practice, and ergo, it disappears. But actually, that's happening automatically. You're not the doer. It's all happening on its own because the spanda is prior to the formation of awareness, consciousness, and the you call yourself. The spanda appears and disappears on the absolute. And since the spanda appears and disappears on the absolute, as the absolute, there is no spanda. And even more so, as the absolute, there is no absolute. Question: is there a relationship between the waking state, the deep sleep state, and the dream state? The waking state, the deep sleep state, and the dream state are all appearances on the absolute. They actually have nothing whatsoever to do with who you are. In the dream state, you might dream you own a big house, but when you wake up, it's gone. And in the same way, in the waking state is more solidified, or it appears to be a more solidified dream, but you appear to have an I which has all of these things. When you go into deep sleep state, it all disappears. The only thing that's consistent is the absolute, which is prior to or beyond or without the waking state, the deep sleep state, or the dream state. Those are all appearances. There's a very famous story from a book called the Ashtavakra Gita. The story is very simple. Baba Prakashananda told it to me this way. King Janaka was this incredibly wealthy king, and he had a kingdom, and one day he wanders off and he goes to a riverbank. And on the riverbank, he falls asleep. And in the sleep state, he drifts off into a dream. And in this dream, he's a beggar. And he has no food and he has no money. And he has this horrible experience in the dream state of being a beggar and penniless, like homeless person. When he wakes up from that, all of a sudden the beggar is gone. But he wonders to himself, am I a king dreaming of being a beggar? Or am I a beggar dreaming of being a king? So as Prakashananda told the story, he sent the word out to the kingdom, to all the wise sages, which is true. Am I a king dreaming of being a beggar, or a beggar dreaming of being a king? And as time went on, eventually, this sage named Ashtravaka appeared. And the question was, am I dreaming a king being a dream, or am I dreaming that I'm a beggar, or which way is it? Which is true? And Ashtravaka said, neither one of them true. They're both appearances. They're both illusions. Why that is important is the waking state, the deep sleep state, and the dream state are all appearances on the absolute. The absolute has no waking state, deep sleep state, or dream state. Question. I have heard it said that the true test of an enlightened person is that they don't sleep, but rather they stay aware through the deep sleep state. How do you see it? This is a misunderstanding. First off, awareness is a temporary state. It is not a permanent, stable state. Again, the reason you don't know it is because there's no way or vehicle to know or know about it. There's no awareness there to notice its absence. It's the absence of awareness, or what Maharaj called unawareness, is what the absolute is. It is not awareness. Awareness comes and goes. Now, all yogas are derived from Raja Yoga or Ashtanga Yoga, which are all 8 limbs. The 6th limb is called Dharna. Dharna means concentration, and all the Dharnas in the Vijnana Bhairav are techniques to help develop awareness. Awareness is Dharna. They're called Dharnas because it's the 6th limb, and the greater context is Raja Yoga or 8 limbs. The 6th limb is developing awareness. Awareness comes and goes. When you go to the 7th limb, or dhyana, which is meditation, there's just a continued focus of awareness on a single object. The 8th limb is called samadhi, which very simply means know me. You're beyond awareness and beyond any kind of meditation and beyond any kind of concentration. So they build on one another. Awareness is temporary. And since the waking state, the deep sleep state, and the dream state are all temporary, and awareness is temporary, why would that have anything whatsoever to do with the ultimate who you are, which Maharaj called unawareness, which is without the waking state, the deep sleep state, the dream state, or even awareness itself? So all yogas are originating quotes from Raja Yoga, also the 6 yogas of Naropa, which is indirectly related to Kashmir Shaivism and the Vijnana Bhairav, are about developing awareness. But once you move further along, even that falls away into unawareness, and the absolute is unawareness. And that's why Nisargadattovi Maharaj said, in the absolute, I don't even know that I am. Question. I have been practicing the dharnas from the Vijnana Bhairav for years, yet I am still stuck in awareness. How can one move beyond awareness, and how can one combine Maharaj with Kashmir Shaivism? The best way to appreciate it is to do a dharna. A simple dharna from the Vijnana Bhairav is to experience your entire physical skin is as a wall. And notice, as you focus your attention inside the wall, you can contemplate there is nothing substantial inside of it. And you'll notice just the emptiness inside the physical body. Now, the key thing that people often leave out in doing an exercise like that is that the one who is doing the noticing is made of the same emptiness as the emptiness that was contemplated. In other words, there's emptiness inside the body. The knower of that emptiness, the awarer of the emptiness, the observer of the emptiness is made of the same emptiness. And that's a piece that moves the Vijnana Bhairav and the Dharnas from being a sixth limb, where you're developing awareness of the emptiness, to disappearing as the emptiness and the one who's noticing the emptiness are made of the same substance. Just to give another example, imagine a time, or remember a time, or recall a time when you felt angry or sad or afraid. Focus your attention on the story as to why you feel angry or sad or afraid. Now take your attention off of the story as to why you feel what you feel, and put your attention on the feeling itself. Now take the label off of the feeling and have it as energy or consciousness, allowing it to do whatever it does. And now notice what occurs if the awarer or the knower or the one that just did this process is made of the same substance as the energy or consciousness. That, again, shifts things. So rather than developing awareness of emptiness or awareness of consciousness or being aware of being aware, the shift is that the one that's aware is made of the same substance of that which it's aware of, in this case, consciousness or emptiness. So if we go back to the first, we'll call it meditation, done in the middle 1980s when quantum psychology was being developed, it was without depending upon thoughts, memories, emotions, associations, perceptions. Are you worthy, unworthy, or neither? Without depending upon thoughts, memories, emotions, associations, perceptions. Are you defined, undefined, or neither? Without depending upon thoughts, memories, emotions, associations, perceptions. Are you a man, a woman, or neither? Notice the no state of the nonverbal I am. Now allow your consciousness or awareness to expand outward and backward, noticing the vast emptiness and how it appears to go on forever. And notice what occurs if the emptiness and the one that's noticing the emptiness is made of the same substance. So getting back to the question, it's easy to get stuck in a state of awareness or in awareness itself, which is limb 6 or dharana. To move prior to it or beyond it or without it, you have to go, in quotes, beyond or prior to without awareness. A possibility is to see the emptiness or the consciousness as made of the same substance as the knower or awarer or perceiver of the emptiness or the consciousness. There is no world. When you go to sleep and dream, upon awakening, the dream disappears. Upon awakening, the world begins to disappear. Question. I recently took a workshop where the teacher said, it's not all an illusion. It's your concepts of what the world is that is an illusion. I'm confused because throughout all of your work, you keep on repeating that Nisargadattovi Maharāj told you it's all an illusion and that the Buddha said there is no world. Anything you can say about this, please excuse the expression, how it personally affects or has affected you would be great. The best way to answer this question about there is no world is to tell the story I've told endless times, because it was probably the most important time I spent with Nisargadatta. I had asked him a question, and he got incredibly angry, and he started yelling at me. And as he was pacing back and forth, he said to me, there is no birth, there is no death, there is no person. It's all a concept. It's all an illusion. And he went like this with his hands, and light passed through me. And he said, now you know the nothing, and so now you can leave. Now, I went absolutely into no world, in the sense there was so nothing and there was so no world that there wasn't even an I to know there was no world. I left his apartment near Ketwadi. I walked out in the middle of Bombay about 6:30 at night, which would have been a hassle anyway. I walked to Grant Road, I got a cab, I went to the train station, I got a ticket, I got on the right train. I negotiated and moved through all of that. I was so nothing, there was no I. I have no idea how it happened. There was no I to know about it. There was just so nothing that there wasn't even a knowingness or nothing at all. Zero. About 2.5 hours passed, and I had to get off the train, and all of a sudden, I snapped out of it. And all of a sudden there was an I and there was a world. The question then is, how did I get from his apartment, which I obviously did, through Ketwadi, to Grant Road, to a train station, to all of these different steps in a hassling Bombay at 6:30 at night? I have no knowingness of it. There wasn't even an I which knew there was no world. There wasn't even an I which knew there was no knowingness of no world. Somehow the body-mind negotiated all of that. There truly was no world. Yet the body-mind did all of these things without an I or anything to know or to know about it. So it's all an illusion. There is no world. And the appreciation of that is critical. Because if you do not appreciate that, you'll always be trying to integrate into something that does not exist. So the world only exists in the waking state. It does not exist in the dream state. It does not exist in the deep sleep state. And in Turiya, which is a whole nother state, there is no world. And so appreciating this helps to clarify when they said to Nisargadatta Maharāj, who are you? He said, nothing perceivable or conceivable. If you can perceive it or conceive it, it's not me. Therefore, discard it. And one of the most beautiful statements was by Nagarjuna in the 2nd century. He said, there never was a Buddha who taught anything. Question: can you talk about Turiya and Turitita? Normally people talk about the waking state, the deep sleep state, and the dream state. Obviously they're states, so they come and go. That's why in YouTube #1 in the trilogy, Advaita is Vedanta, we looked at, the very opening piece looks at that if you have an experience in the waking state, it's a temporary experience within a temporary experience called the waking state. So all of these states, waking state, deep sleep state, and dream state, are all temporary. Turiya state is a state. The thing about Turiya is there is nothing, it's a completely different state. In other words, when I'm in the deep sleep state, I don't know about the waking state. When I'm in the dream state, I don't know about the waking state. And when in the waking state, I only have a memory that I was in the waking state or the deep sleep state or the dream state. In Turiya, all of that disappears. You have no knowingness of the deep sleep state or the waking state or the dream state. There's no knowingness in this. There's nothing there whatsoever without a knowingness. When you come out of Turiya, what you have with you is the most subtle memory that you were in some kind of state where there is nothing. But it's the most subtle memory of it. The confusion that people have is they assume, for example, when they realize or get enlightened, that somehow they're going to be in the waking state and be enlightened. The waking state is temporary. The deep sleep state is temporary. The dream state is temporary. And even Turiya, the bare, subtlest knowingness, there's just nothing. But it carries a memory with it, is a temporary state. Turitita has no memory whatsoever. And that's the big difference. In Turitita, it's almost like there's a stamp that you were in Turitita, and it's like comes a background, nothing prior to the absolute nothingness, prior to awareness, prior to consciousness, that is always there, and everything else appears on it. So it's almost like a stamp that carries through deep sleep state, dream state, waking state, and even Turiya. But there's no actual memory or knowingness of what it is to be in Turitita. And in Turitita, because there's no memory, there's no awareness, there's no consciousness, there's no knowingness, there's no observer, there's just no memory other than this very, very subtle, I like to call it a stamp, a background stamp, and that's all it is. Samskaras. Question. You talk about samskaras as being in different parts of the body. Can you say something about how that affected you directly? As I mentioned again in YouTube #1, Advaita is Vedanta, for the most part, belief systems get stuck in your eye blink, your heartbeat, or your breathing apparatus. But it is not limited to that area. So when I was with Nisargadattovi Maharaj, and he went, there's no birth and there's no death and there's no person, and he went like this, and light passed through me. The part of the story that oftentimes gets left out is, shortly after that, I had extreme pain in my liver and in my spleen. And no matter what doctor I went to in India, nothing changed that. In fact, actually, for 2 years, I almost was walking around kind of like with my hands on my liver and spleen. When I left India in around June of 1982, I eventually wound up in Los Angeles, and my dear friend David took care of me. He was a doctor, and he ran all kinds of tests on me, and they found nothing. And one day, my psychology mentor, Dr. Eric Marcus, and I met and had lunch. And I said to Eric, are you still teaching? And he said, yeah, I'm still teaching psychologists. And I said, I'd like to come to one of your groups and be the demo. I'll be the client in front of all these psychologists, and you can do whatever you do. and let's see what happens. So he said, fine. So a few days later, I showed up at his group and surrounded by about a dozen psychologists with little notebooks. And I'm sitting there and I'm the client. And Eric begins to work with me. Very simple, kind of Gestalt therapy type of thing, liver, spleen, back and forth, and talking, be the liver, talk to the spleen, that kind of stuff back and forth. Nothing particularly fancy. The session ends in front of the group. I leave and I go downstairs and I put my key in the car. And just as I turn it, all of a sudden I'm back in the room where Maharaj said, there is no birth, there is no death. It's all a concept, it's all an illusion. And went like this with his hand. And it somehow went into my liver and spleen. And what emerged as I was standing in this parking lot in Los Angeles, unlocking my car, was, I don't exist. Do I exist? What's existence? This huge conflict between existence and non-existence, which I didn't even know I had, but I was experiencing my whole life, and it was enlarged in my liver and spleen. And I looked at it, and the samskara disappeared, and the pain went away. So what occurred was, what Maharaj poured light into me, it loosened those two samskaras, which were actually inside my liver and spleen. And when they arose out of there, and I could see them very clearly, they disappeared and the pain disappeared. And so samskaras can be, and often are, enlarged in different parts of the body. And as long as they're operative and we don't look at them, they'll continue to operate way, 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 way outside of our consciousness or awareness. Another situation, which I wrote about in Nothing Comes From Nothing, but I didn't put it on the second YouTube, which was, I went to see Baba Prakashananda in Bombay one day. I got to the apartment and it was just me and him. And I was sitting with him and feeling pretty good. And all of a sudden I look up, he was on like this bed and I was on the floor. And all of a sudden he's smiling at me. And this energy, this kind of beam of energy is pouring into me. Now at the time, I was reading Meher Baba. And Meher Baba had said that the ego is like an iceberg, that 90% of it is underwater. And that when you meditate, this samskaras, whatever, comes up and you can witness it in the light and hopefully it dissolves. He didn't say hopefully, it dissolves. So I was sitting with Baba Prakashananda and this light and energy, this Shakti is pouring through me, but I'm not feeling happy. I am feeling freaked out. And all of a sudden it feels like my body has burst into flames and I am suffering. But I remembered what Meher Baba said, and I looked at Prakashananda with this ray of smile. He had this beautiful moon-like face. And all I could do, I felt like I was holding onto the carpet. And I thought was, okay, he's trying to show me something, but I don't know what it is yet. So I was holding onto the carpet, and he's pouring this Shakti, this light, this energy into me. And I'm just sitting there, suffering, waiting. And all of a sudden, out of nothing, underneath the water, appears this belief which says, I'm sorry that I am. It arose, I looked at it, and it disappeared. My whole life, I had unknowingly been walking around with this samskara called, I'm sorry that I am. And his energy, his Shakti, which had poured through me, lifted it up. It wasn't enlarged in a particular part of my body. It was just more in my field, so to speak. And it just appeared. I looked at it and it disappeared. And he just looked at me and I looked at him, and I just ray of smile. And all I could do was, touch his feet, thank you. And I left. And so these samskaras are very, very deep, and they're operating way, way outside of your awareness, or you're so used to them, you don't even know that they're there. And that's why Maharaj used to say, you can't let go of something until you know what it is. The teaching master and spiritual practice. Question: can you talk more about the teaching master? The best way I could describe a teaching master is back in the early 1970s, I was in my early 20s and I was being trained as a therapist. My mentor, Dr. Eric Marcus, I consider to be a psychology teaching master. We used to do these workshops up in the mountains, about an hour and a half or 2 hours from Los Angeles. It was one of those, at the time, it was the early 70s, so we did 3-day workshops, and there were about 18 to 20 people, and you had a circle, and of course they had the famous hot seat in the middle of the circle. And when you wanted to work on something, you say, I want to work, and the person would stand and come to the middle of the circle, and of course the therapist would work one-on-one with the client in front of the group. So one day we're sitting there, and this woman begins to cry, and of course she wants to work. And she said to Eric, I'll come to you, which she was going to move from the circumference, the end of the circle, to the middle to work with him. I'll come to you. And Eric said, no, I'll come to you. And he moved to the middle of the circle. To me, it's so stuck inside of me because that was a teaching master. He, the therapist, adjusted to her. She did not have to adjust to him. And the beauty of that was that in the world of psychology and spirituality, the teaching master and the master, there's a differentiation. There's the master, and the teaching master has a teaching function. The no-state state is the same, but the teaching master has a teaching function. He adjusts to who's in front of them. He does not have a ashram or a center or whatever and a context of concepts, and you as the devotee or student adjusts to him. Look at his concepts, take on his concepts of the way you're supposed to be, do, act, or behave, but rather he adjusts the practice to you. The story I often tell is of the Sufis back when, as they were told to me, was, let's imagine there were 10 Sufi masters, and you went to Sufi master number 1. He would spend some time with you and say, you know something? I'm not the right fit for you. Go to Sufi master number 7. If I went to Sufi master number 9, he would spend some time with me and might say, why don't you go to Sufi master number 3? So they sent you where you needed to go. They adjusted to you, and if it wasn't a good fit, they would send you where you needed to go, rather than having you organize around them and their concepts. That's a true teaching master. So on the teaching master side, there's a functionality to it, which means the teaching master not only adjusts to you, but he has to get a sense of vibrationally and samskara-wise where you are, and he has to match the practice with your vibrational pattern so that it loosens or neutralizes. Probably the best metaphor I could think of is in homeopathic medicine. In homeopathic medicine, there's a most famous saying is, like cures like, which means in this context that I have a particular problem, a samskara, and the teaching master matches the practice to neutralize that energetic vibratory relationship, that field, and so that it neutralizes and disappears. Now, for the teaching master, it requires several things. Like the Sufi master who sent you where you needed to go, the teaching master has to recognize several things. The first thing is they have to recognize their own personal, in quotes, personal limitations. What that means is temperament-wise. The second thing is they have to notice the limitations of their approach. In other words, whatever approach or techniques or mantras, yantras, tantras they're using, who it will work for and who it won't work for, and the limitations of that particular thing so that it matches with the person that they're with. So it has to acknowledge their limitations and their own limitations of their approach, and that has to be intertwined with, of course, where the particular student or devotee or disciple is. For me, that is student or devotee centered rather than guru centered, where I adjust to the guru adjusts to me, to where I am. And that's why the famous Zen saying, which is, the doctor first has to be able to diagnose the disease before they can give the medicine. Question: is there a purpose? No, there is no purpose. In the early 1970s, I had a kind of a spontaneous experience where I realized the answer to the Zen koan, what's the sound of one hand clapping? And in that instantaneous realization, immediately I recognized there was no choice, there was no purpose, there was no volition. Whatever was going to happen was going to happen, and was not going to happen was not going to happen. And that awakening never left. The problem was that over the next 5 years, everyone I told about no choice, no volition, no purpose, everyone I told that to was like, thought I was crazy. But the, in quotes, experience, that awakening was so powerful, it was always a background with me. And in 1979, I met Nisargadatta, and one of the first days I was there, I told him my recognition. No point, no purpose, no choice, no volition, no what's going to happen is going to happen, what's not going to happen is not going to happen. And he listened and he said one thing to me in one word. He looked at me and he went, obviously. Now, the beauty of that and why he was so extraordinary was a teaching master validates absolute knowledge. And they confront very, very intensely things that are, in quotes, untrue. So he validated that. And by him flowing, that validation was like, what a relief. It's true. I always knew it was true. Now, oftentimes people always say he was so confrontive and he was so this and so that. Again, a teaching master, like in homeopathy, if I have a disease, which in homeopathy is seen as a vibration, they match the remedy, the potency. The potency of the remedy is attempted to be matched to the potency of the vibratory rate of the disease. In the same way, if I have a samskara, the potency of the teacher that comes at him has to match that. Otherwise, it's not going to work. The best metaphor I could use is this. Let's imagine you had a friend of yours who was an alcoholic. And you could see it, and they were doing things that were very self-destructive. And you went to them, and you said to them, you're alcoholic and maybe you need to get into a program or to some therapy or this or that, they probably would not say, oh yeah, thanks man, I'll go do that. They probably would say, what an asshole. And they would probably discard you or distance you as a friend, and would probably hang out with other people who would enable them to continue their drinking pattern. That's why, in that metaphor, they have interventions. In interventions, you have the alcoholic, and all of a sudden their loved ones, their siblings, or their spouses, whoever, gather around them. They even bring food and drink, and they plan to stay there in a confrontational way until the denial level on the part of the alcoholic is hopefully broken by the intensity of the intervention. That's why you need several people. In the same way, the intensity of the confrontation has to match the vibratory rate of the devotee or the disciple. Otherwise, it'll be like water just being poured over them, and it'll have no effect whatsoever. So Maharaj always attempted to match that vibratory rate. And I could say that was the reason he was yelling at me all the time. I was so inert and so not seeing and so in denial, he had to escalate his vibratory rate and yell at me to break through that level of denial I had, rather than enable the denial. And many teachers enable their students. Zen masters and teaching masters do not enable their students to continue on the same pattern by giving them practices or allowing them to perpetuate their samskaras. In the early 1970s, there was the old S training. And I was sitting in the S training, and there was a man, and he was standing up and he was going toe to toe with the trainer. And the man was clearly in some kind of denial and some kind of pattern. And the trainer was confronting him very intensely. And someone got up from the audience and yelled at the trainer, "Why don't you give him a break?" And the trainer looked at him and said, "You're the kind of person who would offer an alcoholic another drink." So a teaching master doesn't offer you another drink. A teaching master is no game. And they're confronting and matching, even intensely, your vibratory level. And in order for that to work and happen, the student has to realize and trust that the teaching master, they have to get the teaching masters on their side. There's an intensity. And for this, if the student runs away and goes into further levels of denial, as we say in psychology, all patterns escalate. They'll continue to get confronted, just by the world or the universe will smack them down. So the teaching master, really, it's an art. And that's why a teaching master is so unusual. And that is, they're willing to do that and to match that, and they have that functionality. I remember about 1995, I was in Amsterdam, and a devotee of Maharaj, who's now passed away, named Alexander Smith, handed me an old videotape of Nisargadatta Maharaj, which appears in Moments with Maharaj. And I'm watching the videotape, and there I am. And there's Nisargadatta. I remember that day like it was yesterday. And what shocked me was, I was like in terrible pain. I remember that day so clearly. It was hot and I was in pain. I didn't want him to throw me out. I wanted to be there, but I was suffering so terribly that the only thing I could think watching this video was, wow, this incredible Mahatma, Nisargadatta Maharaj, took the time to confront me. He confronted me like nobody else ever had. And in that confrontation, those painful parts, those painful samskaras, ultimately, it took years, were able to come to the surface and dissolve. So the fact that the teaching master takes the time to do that, what can you say? But thank you. Integration. Question. You always quote from Zen, yet in Zen, the 10 bulls, the last stage is returning to the marketplace. That means integration back into the world. Actually, the 10th stage of back to the marketplace, or entering back into the marketplace, or what's termed integration, has nothing whatsoever to do with you coming back, spanda, appearing back into the world. The last and final state is everything is the absolute. In other words, the state of integration is a state where you realize everything is the absolute. It has nothing whatsoever to do with you entering into or the world and doing some kind of function or other, or serving or teaching or a mission or nothing to do with any of that. The final state of integration is everything is the absolute. Everything is the absolute. Now, the important thing in that is it is a state of integration. The beauty of Zen, and Zen koans specifically, is that they locate where you might be nesting, whether it be a state of I hate myself or I love myself, or a state of this choice, or a state of awareness. In the state of integration, 10 bulls, everything is the absolute. The next question would be, if everything is the one, where does the one come from? If the state of integration is the Zen koan, this is it. There's only the absolute. To go even prior to that, if everything is the one, where does the one come from? Breaks down even that final state of integration. If everything is the absolute, where does the absolute come from? The mind. Question. Everyone talks about the mind and how it holds the illusion together. Can you talk about what holds the mind together? There are 8 basic pillars that hold the mind together. 1, it's better to be there than here. 2, oppositions, that there is always something in opposition. 3, location, I am here and you are there, or I am here and it, what I want to be, do, or have, or create, is over there. 4, experiences are separate from me. In other words, there is a separation between me and my experience, because without that separation, neither I nor I am could be. Nisargadattovi Maharádžovi, the experiencer and the experience come and go together. Number 5, the ongoing movement from appearing, disappearing, or from something, nothing, which yields the illusion of a solid, continuous, and permanent world and existence. 6, the concept of change, the illusion that things change, transform, or transmute or transcend. This includes the hopium of change. 7, I exist or I am. 8, the tendency to want to be or become, do, have, or create. If there is a you experiencing any of these 8 elements, then there is a mind functioning. Awareness and consciousness. Deconstructing awareness. The qualityless quality of awareness is superimposed or anthropomorphically projected upon that which does not have qualities. In other words, because I, as a body-mind, I have consciousness, sentience, a location, and awareness, I assume and project that the Absolute has consciousness, sentience, a location in space-time, and awareness. Being aware of being aware still might have a formless, localized quality. Then the formless, localized quality is projected upon that which has no qualities and has not even a qualityless experience and has no location. The Absolute is not knowable because it has no vehicle to know or know about it or itself. The Absolute is not awareable because it does not contain awareness. The Absolute is not conscious, nor does it have presence or sentience because it contains no consciousness or presence or vehicle to know about consciousness, sentience, presence, or awareness. Even the qualityless, non-local state of being, the operative word being state of being, it could be said that when you hear the word state, you could use the word illusion, therefore the illusion of being. Awakening occurs when the spanda stops and when you slip outside of the physical universe and are prior to the physical universe. Not only then is there an absolute nothingness which may or may not have a view of consciousness floating in emptiness, but there is not any I and not any people or things or solid universe anymore. It is the slipping in and out of that physical universe and then holding both positions at the same time, and then eventually just staying outside of the physical universe where the final awakening is realized. Nisargadattovi Maharāj paraphrased, find the space prior to where being becomes non-being and non-being becomes being. In order to go beyond the qualityless state of awareness, which is being aware of being aware, or being awareness along with its cousin consciousness, or being conscious of being conscious, or being consciousness, all of those states have to be recognized as a state, a veil, a covering, or a layer. Once that recognition occurs, as Maharaj said, then you have found the space between being and non-being, prior to or without consciousness and awareness. At that point, the most you can say is that out of the absolute nothingness, prior to the witness, without awareness, there is a formless, non-local view, which knows nothing about location, awareness, consciousness, knowingness. It just rests within itself without any movement, karma, or primal movement, desire, or spanda, pulsation. Being aware of being aware still holds a formless, no-time quality to it, which is then projected upon that which has no qualities and is not even quality-less. The absolute is not knowable because it has no vehicle to know or know about itself. It is not awareable because it does not contain awareness. And it is not conscious, nor does it have presence, because it contains no consciousness or presence. The absolute is without a vehicle to know about consciousness or presence. Ultimately, when the spanda stops, there is no absolute nothingness. The absolute nothingness is an appearance on the absolute. Beyond this cannot even be spoken about, or as Maharaj said, anything you say it is, it isn't. Question. I recently took a workshop, and the constant ongoing question was, are you aware? Isn't there an awareness or consciousness? There is a state of awareness, there's a state of consciousness. Consciousness and awareness come and go. They're not permanent. They are states which come and go. Being aware of being aware comes and goes. The problem is there's no vehicle to know or know about or be aware of their absence. It is the absence, with a capital A, of awareness, which is the absolute. Awareness and consciousness appear on the absolute. So since awareness and consciousness appear on the absolute, and awareness and consciousness come and go, they are not permanent, they are come and go, they are temporary states or stations, and they are lenses which hold together the illusion of being, that give the illusion of solidity, continuity, and location to an illusory world. So awareness and consciousness come and go. They're not permanent. They're temporary states. Being aware of being aware is a temporary state because it still requires awareness. So just if you notice right now that you're aware, now be aware of being aware. Notice what occurs when I say, what awarer is awaring this? So awareness is a subtle nesting state which comes and goes. Its absence cannot be registered. Being aware of being aware is an even more subtle station or state to nest in that comes and goes, no vehicle to know that it even exists, no vehicle to measure its absence. And what awarer is awaring that, it just dissolves. I don't even know what awareness is, other than a state or station that may or may not exist. But certainly it is temporary and has nothing whatsoever to do with who you are. Question. Isn't awareness or consciousness a step toward the absolute? Yes, you could say it is a station on the way to the absolute. The thing to always keep tucked away in your consciousness is mu. The answer to the Zen koan, does a dog have Buddha nature? Buddha nature is defined as awareness and consciousness. Does a dog have Buddha nature? Mu. Mu means without. Is it a state? You could say if you were on that train and hit the station called consciousness, it's easy for students and teachers both to nest there. Or being aware of being aware is a very, very subtle state or station, a lens, if you will, and a place for teachers and students to nest. But the absolute is mu. It is without consciousness and without awareness. Reincarnation. Question. So many religions, particularly in the East, talk about a soul reincarnating again and again and again. Is that true? When most people talk about reincarnation, they're imagining a separate individual self or soul which incarnates from lifetime to lifetime to lifetime, with some goal in mind, like improving or learning lessons or some kind of karma and all this other stuff. Maharaj's response to that was that reincarnation is a concept for the ignorant masses. When he said that, what he's referring to is the underlying structure, that there's cause and effect, and there's an individual soul that incarnates to learn lessons and to reach the oneness, who's got a purpose, and the only purpose of incarnating is to reach all of that stuff. He would say that's just for the ignorant masses. When we think about reincarnation, I don't think about a separate individual self or soul. Another way to view it is as a vibration. So from the, in quotes, point of view of the absolute nothingness, there's a, we'll call it original sound. Now, most people have that original sound as Om. But actually, the original sound is more of a, almost like a ping. The ping, it's very close to a sound of some of the Tibetan gongs. When you hear someone hit a gong, it's very similar to that. And so out of the absolute nothingness comes this gong, this ping, which forms a ripple in the absolute nothingness. And those ripples are vibrational in nature. Now, since in the 6 yogas of Naropa, they would talk about a manifesting void and an unmanifesting void. When the ping, that gong, sound, that sound occurs, you're going to get a ripple and a vibration. And since it is holographic, it carries with it ultimately the sense of I or me or you. Now, from the point of view of an I, me, or you would say there's some kind of linearity there. In other words, this happens, this happens, this happens, and I carry with it. The manifesting void with a holographic consciousness carries all the collective consciousness of everything that is, was, and will be, is all in that manifesting void. That ping, which we interpret through the transduction of our brain and nervous system as Om, is actually a ping sound which begins the vibratory rate which forms everything in the physical universe. Actually, there's a mantra that I heard in the early 1970s, which means the one unfolding universe of sound. If you went into the Bible, it would say in the beginning was the Word. In beginning was this ping, this sound out of the absolute nothingness, which forms a vibration, and contained within the manifesting void, it's all holographic, appears what you call you. You're actually just a vibration or a combination of vibrations. One of the ways to imagine this metaphorically is if we had a lake and I threw a big rock into the middle of the lake. Ping, gong, that gong sound. It's a beautiful sound, that gong sound, that ping sound. All of a sudden you would get ripples, and the ripples would hit the shore and would come back and form all other ripples, and they would intersect. What you are is a combination of vibratory rates coming together, and it forms what you call you, but originates with the original sound, originates in quotes, the ping, not Om, ping. And that sound forms the vibratory rate called you. There is no linearity to it. There is no cause and effect to it. It's just intersecting vibrations. When all of that, when that ping dies down, and all of a sudden there's just the absolute nothingness, you could say there's just the lake. Once there's just the lake, there's just a void, which is prior to the manifesting void or the holographic consciousness, which contains everything. This is why, if to be fully awakened, which is extraordinarily rare, means there's no longer any vibratory movement, just the lake. And that's it. Nagarjuna, again, had this beautiful way of saying it. There never was a Buddha who taught anything. Why? Because there's no consciousness, there's no awareness, there's no rippling, which forms a you or an I, me, or mine. There's just the lake. So there never was a Buddha who taught anything. This is reminiscent of the very famous, Zen gets the credit for it, but it really comes from Bishop Berkeley, which is, if a tree falls in the forest and there's nobody there, does it make a sound? Without any more ripples, there's no you. Without any you, no vibration, no ripples, no sound, no lake. That's why it's also so beautiful in Zen when they say, if you see Buddha on the street, kill him. What does that mean? If you see a perceiver seeing Buddha, consciousness, awareness, and all that follows from it, dissolve it, let it go. Let it just be in the lake, the absolute, the manifesting void, and let it just dissolve until the I itself dissolves. And so there's no linearity, and in that sense, there's no continuous you reincarnating. There's just the vibratory ripples which appear. And when the vibratory ripples and the movement stops, there never was a Buddha who taught anything. Ergo, there's no karma meaning movement, at all. There's just the absolute prior to consciousness. Question: if what we see is a byproduct of vibration and movement, is our destiny already determined? Yes. Nisargadatta Maharaj said to both Jayashri and Dr. Vanaja that the film starts at the moment of conception. The film already starts, whether you'll realize or not realize, married, everything. It all happens at the moment of conception. And one of the most beautiful things Dr. Vanaja said that Maharaj told her was, stay out of the film. In other words, who you are is prior to the film. So appreciating this helps to appreciate. I was once with Baba Prakashananda, and I was sitting around with a bunch of my Guru brothers and sisters. And in India, they have these little tins. And he looked at the first person and said, how many japatis? He had a tin full of japatis. He said, how many japatis do you want? The person said, 1. Gave him the 1. How many do you want? I want 2. Gave him 2. Third person, how many do you want? I want 3. Person 4, how many do you want? I'll have 1. He passed him out. And then he said, you, to the first person, only could have taken 1. And you could have only taken 2. And you could have only taken 3. It was already, this part he didn't say. You could have only taken 3. In other words, it was already decided. He once said to me, Narayan, God has already decided how far he's going to take you. What do you care? The illusion of a separate self. There is no separate self. There is no non-dual self. There is no such thing as a separate temporary self. There is no such thing as a non-dual, eternal, permanent self. Question. It feels like there's one big me, and everything organizes and filters around this one big me, which seems to be located in the body. There isn't one big me, and if I just get rid of it, then I'll be realized or enlightened or something. Gurdjieff said it best when he said, there's not one I, but many I's. In other words, there's endless amounts of intertwining ripples or vibrations or what you call I, and they're all intertwined. Imagine a ball of string. My grandmother used to collect strings. She'd take different pieces of string and things, and she'd put it together in a ball. Now, each one of these strings we'll call is an identity, or who you think you are. So there's an awful lot of these I's which need to be pulled apart or deconstructed or looked at or let go of. And so pulling these apart is like peeling the layers of an onion. You keep peeling the layers of an onion until eventually, at the end, the onion itself disappears. So there's not one big me, and if I get rid of the me, then I'll be an enlightened master or something. There's an infinite number of these I's and identities, some scars, vibrations, and as each one begins to melt or be deconstructed, eventually it disappears. What the only caution in this is to notice if there's an illusion that if I get rid of all of these I's, identities, structures, some scars, then I will be an enlightened master. That one too is one of the I's or identities. So there's not one big E, one big I or me, that's it, that you have to get rid of or deconstruct. There are many, many, many of these, period. Question. In all the satsangs I have gone to, they keep on saying I have to get rid of this separate self, which I believe in. But no matter how hard I try, the separate self remains. This is complete and total bullshit. You can't get rid of a separate self because there is no separate self. There is no separate self. There is no non-dual self. If I'm trying to get rid of a separate self that doesn't exist, nobody ever succeeds. If I want to be the non-dual self, there's no such thing. These are two concepts. I have to get rid of my separate self so I can be a non-dual self. Both of these two are concepts. Who you are is prior to the concept of a separate self or a non-dual self. It's got nothing whatsoever to do with who you are. This is why Nagarjuna said in the 8 negations of Nagarjuna, there is no duality, there is no non-duality. There is nothing like this to get rid of. That's the reason you can't get rid of it. It's like a dog chasing its tail. You can't get rid of something which doesn't exist. Question. In the 1980s and through the 1990s, you talked about void universes and bubble universes, which always leaves me baffled. Can you explain this further? Probably the best way to go into this is make it a little bit more as an exercise. So if you're listening, you can let your eyes close. And without depending upon thoughts, memories, emotions, associations, perceptions, are you worthy, unworthy, or neither? Without depending upon thoughts, memories, emotions, associations, perceptions, etc., are you lovable, unlovable, or neither? Without depending upon thoughts, memories, emotions, associations, perceptions, etc., are you alone, connected, or neither. Without depending upon thoughts, memories, emotions, associations, perceptions, etc. Do you exist, not exist, or neither? Now notice the no-state state, or the stateless state of that blank emptiness, and allow your awareness to expand outward and backward into the big, almost falling back, noticing the big emptiness and how it appears to go on forever. Now, if you continue to allow the awareness to go outward and backward and falling back and expanding, eventually you might pop out of the void, that emptiness. And what you might notice is different voids that you can be aware of. Each one of those voids is a void universe. Now, if I say, what awarer is awareing that, everything just kind of disappears. Those are void universes. Void universes, bubble universes are very, very similar. Now, in the esoteric literature, they talk about all these different dimensions and all these different universes, and certainly they talk about different lokas. It's called in India, a loka is a world. So each one of these bubble universes or void universes, and as it says in the esoteric literature, there's an infinite number of these dimensions and universes and worlds. One of the most important things to appreciate is that what we call our world, which we think is so solid and real and significant, is only one world, one bubble, one loka. They use the word loka, L-O-K-A, in India to describe a universe or a world. It basically, from way out there in the absolute nothingness, it can appear almost like an island of sand floating in nothingness. But there's an infinite number of them. Nisargadattovi Maharádžovi used to say, there's an infinite number of gods ruling an infinite number of universes. So there's an infinite number of universes. Baba Muktananda talked about Siddhaloka, which is a particular universe he used to go to, where all these great saints or siddhas resided. So there's an infinite number of these universes, bubbles we call them. We can call them void universes. We could call them lokas if you want to get more Indian about it. But the bottom line is this, what we call our physical universe that we live in, which we think is so important, so significant, and so everything, is just one of an infinite number of lokas which appear on the absolute nothingness. Now, each one of these lokas can be viewed as a vibration. So this particular loka has a particular vibratory quality to it, the consciousness. If you extend your awareness out, you can actually get the consciousness and the awareness that contains this particular universe, this particular loka. Each loka, each universe, each one of these, what appears as condensed vibration, has different rules and different mediums and different vehicles. For example, in our universe, we have consciousness and awareness and thoughts and feeling states. In other universes, they do not have that. Now, there's a wonderful term in science called escape velocity. Escape velocity means that in order to leave the gravitational pull of the planet Earth, you have to go approximately 25,000 miles an hour in order to get out of the pull, the gravitational pull. So it's called an escape velocity. Spiritual practice can be aimed to increase the escape velocity so that you are no longer at effect of the gravitational pull of Earth, metaphorically, or you could say consciousness and awareness. Since consciousness and awareness are the vehicles of this loka, which appears permanent but is only temporary and one of many, 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 so the escape velocity is the spiritual practice that brings you beyond or prior to or without this particular loka or this particular, we'll call it universe, so to speak. So as each loka or each universe or each dimension has its own particular rules, mediums, vehicles of exchange, consciousness, awareness, thoughts, memories, emotions, sensations, perceptions, etc., it would require, on a vibrational level, a particular spiritual practice to be able to have, metaphorically, an escape velocity to get prior to it. Now, all of these voids and void universes and locals and all of this stuff appears on the absolute. We, or I, or the I that you think you are, imagines it is living in a particular universe which is solid and consistent, and it's 4.5 billion years old, and our universe is 14.5 billion years old, etc. But it's all confined by the rules and mediums of exchange within this particular loka. So awareness and consciousness are crucial and critical to this particular loka, giving the illusion of solidness, energy, space, mass, time, unlimited energy, unbounded energy, location, electromagnetics. All of those things are held together, continuity, linearity, by consciousness and awareness, which exists in this loka only. It doesn't necessarily exist in other lokas. So the next question would be, what are the basic takeaways from appreciating that this is just one of an infinite number of lokas? The 6 most important takeaways. First, this is a temporary loka. Second, this loka contains the vehicle or medium of perception with a perceiver and contains all perceivables and conceivables. All perceivables and conceivables exist only in this particular loka or universe. Third, this loka or bubble includes the medium of consciousness and awareness, which acts like a glue, giving the temporary illusion of solidness, abundant or boundless energy, space and time, and the illusion of a solid, consistent, continuous, localized world or loka. It is awareness and consciousness which holds together the illusion of this separate and, of course, what we consider a special loka. Consciousness and awareness are what makes this loka or world seem real. Baba Prakashananda said it this way: Shakti is Maya. Nisargadatta Maharaj, consciousness is a cheat. Fourth, all lokas are vibrational in nature, temporary, not solid, and are held together and limited by consciousness and awareness. Fifth, consciousness and awareness appear as though they exist when actually they are vibrations resonating at different frequencies, which only appear to exist when perceived through the vehicle of a brain and nervous system. In other words, it is the brain and nervous system which grants awareness and consciousness its sense of beingness or isness. Actually, consciousness and awareness are only vibrational in nature. Ultimately, consciousness and awareness, from the no-point of view of the Absolute, are non-existent. Sixth, the most important takeaway from all of this is nirvana means extinction. To be fully awakened means you are no longer in any loka or bubble, and you are no longer defined or limited by any loka's vehicles of awareness or consciousness or perception. You are the Absolute, without or prior to any lokas, any bubble universes, including this one we call home, true and real. This is why it is critical to understand that any attempt at integration into this loka or bubble further perpetuates the illusion of this universe as permanent, real, solid, important, and not just another temporary vibration floating in or on the Absolute. This is the old Zen saying, any attempt to move toward it, you move away from it. Why? Because you are depending upon perceivables and conceivables and consciousness and awareness to determine and realize who you are. Who you are is beyond or without any worlds, bubble universes, or void universes. In other words, you are taking this to be real. This is why, relatively speaking, the ultimate letting go is not of the ego or separate self, but rather, as Nisargadattovi Maharāj said, hangs on the belief there is a world. This is both refuted by the Buddha in the Diamond Sutra, there is no world, and by Maharaj when he is asked, who are you? And he answers, nothing perceivable or conceivable. When a student asked him for the simplest way to talk about all of this, he said one thing: nothing is. All that is heard, or that has just been read, seen, or heard, is non-existent. Shankara.